most people who go to jail are quite well behaved in jail. The problem is they return back to the original environment they came from. And I've had prisoners say to me and call me up and say, look, I'm going to commit a crime because I want to go back to jail. Or they will say, I've actually did an armed robbery, I didn't want to do it, but it's less stressful being in jail than in the community.
Welcome to Crime Scene Gold Coast with Guardian Criminal Law. My name's Mark Savic, I'm the Principal of Guardian Criminal Law, and we'll be bringing you podcasts weekly. Variety of topics that can be very sensitive, so please be careful when you're listening, and if you need any assistance at all, we'll include a lifeline number at the bottom of the page. We really appreciate you subscribing and liking our podcast channel. You can listen to us across most social media platforms, Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, and you'll find us there. We look forward to bringing you many episodes in the future. Hello, welcome back to Crime Scene Gold Coast. Today, as our guest, we have Dr. Gavan Palk, forensic psychologist, and we're going to talk about Gavan's career in psychology and also about some psychological conditions that contribute to criminal activity. So I'll like to introduce you to Dr. Gavan Palk. How are you today, Doctor?
Good morning, Mark, and thanks very much for inviting me.
Most welcome. Tell us a little bit about your journey into psychology.
It's a very long journey. At about 15 or 16, I joined the Navy, and that was towards the end of the Vietnam War. Interestingly, I didn't want to kill people, so they sent me off to a psychiatrist, and I ended up becoming a medic. So that was my interest in people, I guess, being a medic and paramedic. And then after leaving the Navy, after about 4 years, I completed my higher skill certificate in Sydney and then went to university where I did a Bachelor in Arts in Psychology, not knowing what I wanted to do at that stage, but ended up joining the Probation and Parole Service at about 25 or 26. And whilst a Probation and Parole Service in Brisbane, an officer, I then completed my 4th years in studies in psychology. Went on and then studied law through the barrister's bar and completed my bar exam. Completed law in 1997, but didn't do my bar till 2006. But during that period, I completed a master's degree in applied psychology at Griffith University, and my focus in that thesis was around. Interestingly, it was one of the first of its kind. It was the Ural basis of sexual offending, your most serious type of psychopathic sex offenders, very dangerous, and looking at how their neural activity works and how their sexual arousal works in relation to having to act on it. So quite complicated. I won't go into it because it is sort of quite complicated biological and neurological research, but it shows that there's a much more profound or deeper aspect to people who commit serious offenders than just the psychology of it. So there can be things happening within their brain that doesn't trigger properly, that doesn't inhibit or doesn't inhibit bad thoughts. So with normal people, we might have a bad thought, and that'll get inhibited. We'll say, no, don't do that. That's bad. That'll hurt someone. Or we don't want to go to jail. But with people that have faulty inhibition processes, and we call that habituation and dishabituation, they're just not habituating to normal cues that suggest something is wrong, and they tend to follow through or ignore it. So, look, I became interested in that kind of research and ended up following on from that and completing my PhD in a little bit of a different field, but that was at the time of when we had lockouts on the Gold Coast. and looking at the success of that and how successful it was on the Gold Coast, and then introducing them in Brisbane and working with the police to evaluate those lockouts. Not as successful in Brisbane, but they were quite successful on the Gold Coast. So we're looking at sort of policing alcohol-related sort of incidents and best practices, and how the police dealt with that, the violence surrounding that. So essentially, I've sort of ended up leaving corrective services after getting to director level, an acting executive director level after about 21 years, and joining the university where I became a lecturer and researcher. So that's sort of a bit of my background. So I've sort of virtually been involved, I guess, with people from my early 20s right through most of my life.
Thanks for the background, but I just wanted to unpack a couple of things there. You joined the Navy when you were 15 or 16?
Yes, that's correct. You could in those days. Today you regarded it's illegal, and it's you regarded as a boy soldier. So yeah, essentially there were 16-year-olds on HMAS Sydney going off to Vietnam. Most people didn't realise that. And
in what capacity would a 16-year-old?
They would have been ordinary seamen. They had a training venue called HMAS Lewin, where they took in boys at 15 straight from school, and they educated them and upgraded their schooling and educated them in Navy work and warfare, and then they went to sea on ships as ordinary seamen prior to then doing some training. It could be in trade, or in my case, I did paramedical work, or medics they are called nowadays.
So you didn't want to kill people. You weren't interested in any sort of violence.
No.
But you joined the Navy.
Exactly.
So a defence force. So I'm interested in what drove you to join the Navy, a defence force, rather than perhaps a government agency, or pursue a different career path.
I think the stories of my great-grandfather, who was a merchant sailor most of his life, and hearing his stories. But I'd actually wanted to get into art college, but didn't quite get enough points back then to get into art college, and so I ended up applying to join. I joined the Navy actually as a musician, but again,
wow.
I wasn't quite good enough. I didn't have the X factor, if you like. Okay. So I said, "Look, can I go into the general Navy?" And they said, "Yes, by all means, you can join us at HMAS Lewin, and we'll give you a year's education, and then you can select whatever field you want." So yeah, that. But no, I guess at 15 you don't really think about killing people.
No.
We were aware the Vietnam War was on. I had an older brother, who was on the list to be called. I was eventually called, but of course I was in the Navy at that time. So I was covered and had fulfilled my obligations in regard to conscription in that way. But I guess at 15 and 16 you don't think about death and killing, and that brings you back to the psychology of the brain. The brain isn't fully developed. In males, maybe a bit longer than females. They're usually thinking the frontal lobe, which is the front part of your brain, which controls your reasoning and planning ability. The research is telling us it isn't really fully developed till mid-20s now in males. Some males maybe late 20s, in females a little bit earlier. And this is why I suspect it's much easier for defence personnel in recruiting to target young people, particularly their teenage years. They don't have an issue with risk-taking. They're not afraid to take risks. They don't think about dying. It won't happen to me. But once they turn about 25 or 26, they say, I'm out of here. No way. So it's very hard to train people later in their late 20s. Their reasoning has developed. They become aware of the risk and the dangers. They become more aware, I guess, of leaders and officers who aren't skilled, who aren't very good. And if you like, you can use the age, young and dumb or young and vulnerable at 15 and 16. And yes, I guess that's where most of us were. Look, there are in that particular group, there are 120 who started, 95 who graduated, and I'm still connected with about 70 to 80 of them.
Wow.
So we still get together quite regularly from that group, and a lot of them stayed in for many years. Some of them became commanders and have served in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Timor and Bougainville. And of course, some of them have passed away and died, and some of them have joined other forces like the Air Force and the Army and have served elsewhere. So yeah, look, it was a tremendous experience for me. Although I only did 4 years, I've still maintained that connection, and it was the Navy that got me interested in learning and thinking. And I developed a love for that, and that's why I wanted to leave and join the university. I did start to want to study in the Navy, but once they categorised you, they want to keep you in their little hole. At that time, I was thinking of doing a lab technician's course, which was a couple of years at then the QIT, now QUT in Queensland. It's still part of the Navy, but I ended up leaving and doing my higher skill certificate in Sydney and going to uni.
So when you're talking about that cohort that you had in the Navy that you're still closely connected with, were they all your age when they joined as well? So you're all similar age. So you guys effectively grew up like in the Navy.
Yes.
You did a lot of you growing up together in the Navy.
Yes, there were a couple actually who lied about their age or falsified their age, and may have even been younger, a year or 6 months younger, not quite the age. But they were discovered later, but because they'd reached the age, and their parents were happy for them to stay in. So yes, your parents needed to sign something, and then you sort of re-signed, and at that time you had to sign up for 12 years.
Wow.
And that's all sort of changed now, where 6 years is sort of 4 or 6 years is maximum.
Okay.
So yeah, a very different life. A very different life.
So how many years in the Navy did you spend?
I did 4 years in the Navy.
4 years.
Yes.
So you were about around 20.
Yes.
And you come out of the Navy and then you go to study.
Yes, that's correct.
There's another thing I wanted to ask you about. You've raised a whole heap of interesting questions for me before we get on to the psychology. It's about you going to arts college. So what, in music? Is it?
No, that was
what
actually...
sort of visual arts?
Visual art, yes.
Painting, sculpture?
I used to enjoy painting portraits, and I actually started going part-time whilst I had a job with Dental Houses of Australia in Edward Street above the old Commonwealth Bank. It's no longer there. It was only 4 stories then. And I would go to William Street and train in commercial art. But I was interested in landscapes and portrait, but of course they would say, no, if you want to make money, you've got to draw tins of jams and tins of Vegemite.
Okay, that's for advertising purposes.
Yeah, advertising. So it was commercial art. It was a commercial art school I wanted to get into. And yeah, fair enough. If you've got to go where the market is, and that's where the market was. And back then, of course, you had no computers or anything. Everything was done by hand. But my interest was not in drawing bottles of Coke or tin cans. It was in landscapes and.
Do you still paint?
I haven't painted for years, but yes, I can still sort of sketch and do sort of portraits and things. Yeah.
Fantastic. Can I take you back to the work that you started doing once you left the Navy, and the work in how your work in psychology? Okay,
so when I left the Navy, I completed my degree. I joined the probation and parole office.
Was that here in Brisbane?
That was in Brisbane, yes, and I spent a few years in Brisbane. Then I worked in Woodridge, which was considered a very tough sort of crime area, and then I came to the Gold Coast, and then in my late 20s, I ended up as a manager of the Cleveland Probation and Parole Office. Then for a few years, I did a stint as an advisor or liaison officer to the police minister, Paul Brady, at the time, and worked closely with an interesting man, Kevin Hedges. I remember his name. He was a superintendent or chief superintendent and head of the homicide squad at that time. So he was liaison officer for police, I was liaison officer for corrective services, and we were in a room next to each other in the minister's office. So we I guess work together in crime issues, and one of the things at that time, again, you're going back, we did not have the age of computers, and what was of concern to the police minister at the time was how do we assess serious offenders and their suitability for parole, and we seem to be letting people out and they're reoffending, particularly quite serious offenders, and I suggested that I could probably do a profile of all the serious offenders in jail so that you would have a list, and computers were starting to be, we weren't as sophisticated, but we were able to at least put something together as a profile and put it in a computer. It would have been in the early 90s probably, and computers came in about late 80s or 90s, although governments were a bit slow in getting them. I in fact remember being at the manager at the probation officer at Cleveland, and we were in the township of Cleveland, and the courthouse didn't have a fax machine, and they were at the other end with the police station didn't have a fax machine. They would come to the probation office to use our fax. So that, and we were using old sort of typewriters. So sort of no technology, and I think one police car for the whole of Redlands area. So it's a very different world in terms of how crime was managed. But still, you had your crime researchers who would discover hotspots and do profiling. So this was the sort of work I started doing in the early 90s in the minister's office, was profiling serious offenders so that we could easily access them and say when they put in an application for parole, it would be readily acceptable for corrective services. Now, with the separations of power, of course, the minister couldn't interfere, but he still wanted to have his head across issues and who was getting out, and if something went wrong and ended up in the Courier Mail, he was front page. He would become aware of it. So. Yeah, so that was one part of my role. My other part of my role was actually to try and predict. In those times, there were no questions unnoticed. The minister had to answer questions on the spot as they were given, and my task was to predict what the opposition might ask and actually write a page and a half answer. And the minister would scroll through and find the answer. And, of course, if it wasn't there, I would be in quite serious trouble. 99% of the time it was there. I predicted it correctly.
So when we're talking about serious crime and consideration for parole, what sort of crimes are we talking about that you're looking at when you're talking about serious offenders?
Yeah, serious rapist, serious pedophiles. I remember we had a few characters there. I can only speak generally because I can't break confidences. But we sort of had general pedophiles who would actually kidnap children, take them away, and keep them for a week or something and molest them quite violently. So we had those kinds of pedophiles doing that, and we had a serious serial rapist. We're not anywhere. I hate comparing us to the United States. We do have our serial rapists, but not to the extent that, say, someone in the United States. We had a few little cases of little girls going missing, and then bodies being found at 5-year-old, and I remember a particular case where a man had killed a little girl and had been released after 20 years, and then another little girl went missing. So we had those sorts of we had that quite very serious crime in the 90s and early 2000s.
The question I was sort of leading to, and I'm anticipating a lot of our viewers and listeners would be thinking, on what grounds do you grant parole to somebody who's committed such a violent and heinous crime? What considerations do you take into consideration? What do you consider when making that decision? Now, I can appreciate that if somebody's sentenced to 15 years in prison and they serve the 15 years and that term's up and they have a release date, that seems to be an administrative process whereby they're released. However, a situation of parole must be an assessment that this person is ready to be released under certain conditions, under close supervision for the remainder of their sentence. So it's like a staging of them getting their liberty back. So it's sort of like a halfway point between being in jail and then being free to do as you please. So what is taken into consideration and what can sway the parole board to grant parole, notwithstanding there's been a very violent crime committed?
It's quite a thorough and complicated process. I served for 8 years on the parole board when I was a member of Corrective Services, and I still write and prepare reports for the parole board as a forensic psychologist in private practice. The parole board has changed in the last 4 or 5 years, but it's essentially works along the same, where they have 7 members with a chair as the lead, and you might have police officers, retired police officers serving on the board now, and or community members. They work independently of the government. They operate independently of the government, but obviously they have someone from Corrective Services who sits in and they take advice. They consider all the information very, very thoroughly. And in serious cases, they invariably ask for psychiatric and psychological reports. And it's done on a voting system. The board's made up of 7. If it's 3-3, the chair will have the deciding vote, and then they will be released. But yes, they look at one of the big things they look at is their response in prison. Have they taken steps towards rehabilitation? Have they participated in anger management programs, substance abuse programs, sexual offending programs? Have they done things to improve their education, their vocational, that might improve their employment prospects? Have they got a suitable accommodation to go to? So they would never be released back into the same community where there might be a victim. So you have community corrections in the community looking at those aspects and making sure the home is suitable, that they're not returning to an environment that's similar. What you do find is that most people who go to jail are quite well behaved in jail. The problem is they return back to the original environment they came from. So you've got all those factors that are then contributing to a lifestyle that may lead back to drug abuse and crime. And I've had prisoners say to me and call me up and say, look, I'm going to commit a crime because I want to go back to jail. Or they will say, I've actually did an armed robbery, I didn't want to do it, but it's less stressful being in jail than in the community. I don't have to worry about a job. My meals are paid for me. There's no pressure on me. I don't have to worry about paying board or getting money. So there are a certain element of people, unfortunately, who are cognitively impaired, who have poor education and find it very, very difficult And I don't put that, they're not psychopaths. They're just uneducated, poorly educated, with cognitive impairment, and find life very, very difficult. And it's easier for them to commit a little bit of stealing or do a break and enter. And of course, if they've got the added addition of drug dependency, then their crimes are going to be aggravated. So the whole area of crime is quite complicated. So you will get that proportion of people that are just caught in a rut where they can't get out of, and it's almost it can become intergenerational in that their father was in jail, or they come from a family in which they were abused and their grandfather was abused. So it's extremely difficult. And you see this particularly within Aboriginal communities. They go through all this suffering and pain and poverty and racial discrimination, and having lost their culture or been disenfranchised from their own identity and not even knowing their tribal background. They become lost, and drinking to excess will lead to misbehaviour and public nuisance and driving offences, and often their crimes are low level, but they do it repeatedly, and they're going in repeatedly for short periods of time. And our prison system is overrepresentative by Indigenous people and young, poorly educated, cognitively impaired white people. And I might add too that when you look at the research on ADHD, which is an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, we know from the research that if that isn't managed properly, that at least 50% of them are going to go on to lead a criminal lifestyle. And part of this, I think, is the medication they use, dexamphetamines, which is an amphetamine-based medication to actually help calm them down and slow their brain. So you find people with ADHD are quite intelligent, but because their neurons are going so fast, they can't focus enough to actually follow through with things, or to stay focused to actually stick to a school subject or stay employed, and they become irritable easily and aggressive and abusive easily. And they stop they stop being compliant with their medication in their early teenagers, or around 10 or 12, and they find they're a bit erratic. And what they do find is that if they smoke a bit of marijuana, it makes them feel normal. They smoke some amphetamines, it makes them feel normal. That's the base of the base drug for treatment of these kinds of people. And of course, they become addicted to the ice and the speed, and start living on the streets and getting involved in crime. These kinds of people are not psychopathic. They're not even particularly evil people. They're people with with medical and psychological problems which are manageable. And there are quite successful people in the community with ADHD, lawyers and psychologists, I know them, who take their Ritalin daily and manage their lives quite well and become quite professionally. But what is the difference between a person with an ADHD who goes into crime and a person with an ADHD who becomes a professional? Both, in my experience, having worked in law enforcement for many, many years, and from the research, is the fundamental difference is their functional background. So if, for example, a professional person has ADHD, you'll probably find they come from a supportive family who've managed that health problem and have supported them and have been able to mitigate any difficulties they've had with authority figures in schools, that they've sent them to good schools and ensured they've got good education. They mightn't achieve as well as they could have done if they didn't have the ADHD, but they can still do reasonably well. Those who end up in the criminal system who have these medical and psychological problems are often from dysfunctional backgrounds. They're alcoholic fathers, they're abused, they don't attend school, they don't get educated. So we see all these complicating risk factors happening with them. What we do know too is that good people from good families can go astray and get involved in drugs. I'm thinking of a couple when I was a young probation officer in my 20s, and I'll be fairly general there. I had a young man on probation, not much younger than me, and his girlfriend, both heroin addicts. I had them coming. They were reporting 3 times a week, doing urine test on an intensive program, which a man who's John Quilligan, a really notable man on the Gold Coast back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And we set up an intensive drug prevention program where they could, if they breached, they could have an alternative of going into rehab or go to jail. Unfortunately, those kinds of opportunities aren't there, and that was working quite well. But these particular couple came from a very rich family, and they kept using, kept being positive, and so I had to serve them a summons and take them back to court. And sadly, that very night, the girl overdosed and died. From that point on, the young fella never took drugs again, and he completed my program successfully. So what are we seeing is that if you grow up and you have developed a frame of reference with good values from your parents and your family environment, and you go astray, as some of us do in our teenage years, we tend to drift back to what our frame of reference is in our mid-20s. We go astray, we might break the law, be a bit rebellious, do some drugs, and then suddenly our frontal lobe is fully developed at 25 or 26. I'm not going to do this anymore.
Okay.
They've got a good frame of reference. Yeah. They come from a good family. They've got family there to support them. Yeah. And so they can get their lives back together. But you take a person who doesn't have that kind of background, has a dysfunctional background, doesn't have any values, doesn't have any education, they got nowhere to go.
Right.
And then, so they stay in that life of crime. And then you have a small percentage of human beings who have an addictive personality, and they're just going to stay addicted until they burn out or until they die. And burnout doesn't start to take place till, particularly with males, till your testosterone start to die in your late 30s or in your 40s. So you're having all these processes going on in terms of psychology. Look, learning theory is a very popular theory that says, look, we learn faulty ways of living, and we've got to unlearn faulty ways of living. I'm think learning theory is important, but my theory for criminality is what's called social control theory. It has an element of learning theory in it, but it argues essentially, it's a bit deterministic, that a lot of our traits and personalities are developed by the time we're 9. And we've really got to manage that before we're about 9, or even before our teenage years, before they become hardened. In other words, it's easier to mend a boy than break a man once they've adopted those hard patterns.
What's your knowledge like with regard to genetic behavioural traits? I, in my experience, believe that people are born with certain traits that are hard for them to avoid during the course of their lives. You've raised a couple of issues, one of which is intergenerational trauma, which can manifest in criminal activity, specifically with regard to Aboriginal people. And I've seen that myself as I've worked around Australia and worked with some remote communities, and also my time working with the Aboriginal Legal Service and the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Legal Service. So I have seen that intergenerational trauma that's sort of keeps on getting passed on, and poor social interactions keep on getting passed on and leading to crime. And the crime seems to be a subsistence level crime. It's not crimes that are going to enrich anybody in any substantial way. They're crimes of theft, property theft, use of swiping debit cards to access limited amounts of resources, and usually those resources extend to fuel, food, alcohol, and cigarettes. And on quite a number of cases that I had where young people were breaking into homes, stealing the car keys, stealing the credit cards, their first port of call was the refrigerator. So they'd go to the fridge, and if there was any leftovers or anything they could grab quickly, they'd grab the food. So it was all about subsistence sort of crime. Then you've also raised issues of crime, mental health, and crime. And you talked about ADHD. I did a little bit of research into FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and found that I was getting quite a few clients that would fit into that category. It was hard to get diagnosed. I did write a short paper on it and make a presentation for the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander Legal Service. It's quite fascinating to see the amount of people with FASD that end up being involved in crime. So there's trauma, mental health conditions, but what about these people that do commit really cold-blooded, heinous crimes? They go into jail, they behave while they're in jail, and when they come out, they repeat that crime. Do you think that that's as a result of some sort of genetic mistake, genetic deformity? I'm not sure what the right word to use is, but some sort of genetic error which leads them to that behaviour. And so that it's so compulsive for them, they really can't resist the behaviour if given the opportunity, or they're actually more so than that, they actually calculate and plan for the execution of this sort of behaviour.
Well, you're venturing into the nature-nurture argument, and there, historically, some scientists have believed that we're 50% influenced by genetics and nature, and the other 50% nurture. There's a tendency now to suggest that it's actually 90-10 genetics and only 10% nature. In fact, some interesting.
So 10% genetics?
No, 90% genetic, deterministic.
And then 10% environmental
In
factors.
other words, parents can only have about 10% influence over their children. We may think we have a lot of control over their children, but their nature and what they're going to be is essentially determined, most of it. So what I'm saying is that a lot of health practitioners and medical researchers will say, if you're going to die of cancer, it's already determined in your womb. If you're going to get a certain kind of disease, it's already determined. What we can do is modulate that, live well, don't smoke, don't drink, and we may be able to manage that, and you may be able to live a long life. But if you're determined, then you're going to get it. It just means that you won't get it till you're 80 or 90. But if you live a poor life, you might get it at 50 or 60. So some people with good genetics, for example, they can smoke and drink and live unhealthy lives and still live into their 80s. They may have well made 100 if they hadn't have engaged in those other poor eating and poor dietary habits. So you have this constant argument within the health field as which is the determinant, nurture or nature, and how much control do we really have over it? And the same occurs in criminology, and the same occurs in forensic psychology as to what are the major contributors of bad behaviour. And you've talked about subsistence, which really is just survival and just become a way of life because they come from dysfunctional lifestyles. I don't call those people evil or determined,
No.
Or they haven't been determined to be evil or bad. They don't really. They're doing bad things. They're self-serving to survive. They don't have any other way. But you will get that group of people that, and it's about 1% in the community population, but within the present population, it varies between 7 and 15%. We call psychopaths or psychopathic behaviour. There's people like Professor Hare and Patrick who developed these kinds of trays way back in the 70s and 80s, and it's been developed on it, and there are tests available, and we often use these tests. One's called the Hare Psychopathic Checklist, and in fact the Americans use it in some states to determine whether they're going to execute somebody.
Hare psychopathic test.
Hare psychopathic.
Connor, we can get some sort of access to the Hare psychopathic test so that our listeners and viewers can have a look. They can do the test.
They can Google it.
Do the test.
There are brief aspects of it you can do, but look, it's scored on 40. If you get 30, you're considered a psychopathic and throw away the key. Interesting, in some countries, the score's lower, like Mexico and Scotland. It's about 23 or 25, perhaps because the Scottish are considered a harder type of people. But generally, we base it around the sort of European and Northern American is about 30 when we look at it.
There was a question I was going to ask, and it was with regard to recognition of psychopathy. How early? So we've got a test. At what age would you administer that test? And are there things that parents can look out for in early childhood development that might indicate some sort of psychopathy or an attitude towards doing evil things?
Yes, certainly. We don't refer to children as psychopaths because they're not developed fully, and children as they're growing are malleable and change and can go through phases. But certainly listeners can Google Professor Dadd's work on what's called unemotional callousness. That wasn't his prime interest. He was initially at Griffith University. I think he might be now at the University of New South Wales, or one of the universities in New South Wales. His primary interest was children and children's behavioural problems. But what he did find was he had mothers coming to them with little Johnny, who was they were being cruel to animals and defiant and just mischievous and difficult to manage. And when he started to become interested in this, he started to look at psychopathic traits or callous traits or unemotional, what we call seemingly no empathy in children for little animals. They would be cruel to the puppy or cruel to the baby and not really see that it was wrong or even get some joy out of it. And what he noticed was that when when the children were berated by the mothers or the fathers for being naughty or being cruel to the puppy or to their little sister who was a baby, they would look away. They wouldn't respond. They wouldn't give eye contact, and they would continue in that behaviour. And through observing observing this over a period of time and doing some experimental work, Professor Dadds has decided that what was going on was part of their brain called the hypothalamus, where we have there's two, the amygdala and the septia in the brain, which manages aggression and calm behaviour, wasn't developing appropriately, and it wasn't developing because it wasn't being stimulated. So most children will respond to their mum and dad. They will listen to their mum and dad. They will model their mum and dad in terms of their behaviour, and they will develop empathy. But obviously, if you're from dysfunctional families, you're not going to get that good modelling. That's the first thing. And secondly, if you've got attention deficit disorder, you've got another problem. You're not going to be giving the right kind of attention for that part of your brain to get stimulated. So this starts very early, as young as 2, 3, 4, 5, and your cruel traits are developed by the time you're 9, and this is going back to social control theory, and your listeners can Google social control theory, where your traits are fairly well formed. And Professor Dadds worked out a method by the way which we can improve empathy in young children. It's by getting the mother to say to Johnny, "Look at me, look at me, look at me." That Kath and Kim show, if you watch it, look at me. In other words, having the eye contact, so you're stimulating getting to the back of the brain, or the middle of the brain is where the hypothalamus is, and stimulating that part of the brain.
So that lack of eye contact, it's almost like not wanting to connect with another person, because
you're avoiding it.
We connect through our eyes.
Yes.
And emotionally we connect through our eyes.
Yes.
And so the child refuses to connect emotionally to avoid having to experience any of that feelings of empathy.
Yes.
Wow.
I might add, and this is my own theory, not proven, that it might be because it's uncomfortable for them. They find it painful neurologically, and so they avoid it. Or they might be afraid of being criticised, so they avoid it. They don't want to hear criticism. They might yell and scream and put on a tantrum and run away. And it's really, and it is hard for parents, and you're very lucky if you've got placid children that do listen and watch and learn, and you've got good eye contact. But yes, we're learning, and certainly from Professor Dad's work, we're learning that eye contact at a very young age is very important. I mean, look, that research is still ongoing, I should add, but it seems to have some solid basis to say that that's where the lack of empathy is not developing in that from people who eventually grow up and commit serious crimes such as rape and murder. They don't develop those empathy. I might say that there are people who are psychopaths that don't become bad citizens and don't commit crime. We have them as soldiers. They enjoy to kill, and they make good soldiers, but they stay within the law. We see them among some of our politicians. We see them among some of our business, or even surgeons, or some of our barristers. You have to be quite steel yourself and become quite cold in some incidents. And so there. And if you look at Professor Dad's video on unemotional callousness, it talks a little bit about psychopathy and different kinds of psychopaths who don't become criminals. It can be of some value to the community. But generally, they do lack the empathy. Why? One then might argue from a court point of view, well, if they've got a problem in their brain, why we send them off to jail? Well, there is a difference between someone with schizophrenia and someone who has a mental health problem. They cannot control what they're doing, or they don't know what they're doing. A psychopath knows what they're doing is wrong. They simply don't care, and they simply don't want to control themselves. They can, and they simply believe that they can avoid jail, that they're clever enough to avoid jail. And we see this in some men who are good at scamming vulnerable women and making women feel sorry for them and taking their money. And then some women do that too. In fact, some of the research on women psychopaths is quite interesting, because they are a little bit more skilled than male psychopaths, because they have those higher verbal skills and that skill to be manipulative and appear much more charming and endearing than some men. So watch out for female businesswomen who may not be criminals and won't break the law, but will have those skills to be quite callous in their business and to get the best for their business.
I was going to ask you a question about there's a term that's been thrown around. I've heard it more recently than in the past, and that's the term of toxic masculinity. And then I also heard Jordan Peterson was responding to a question where he asks about toxic humanity or toxic femininity, and put that question to somebody in the audience, what are these things? And I thought about it for a little while, and would you side with me in saying that toxic masculinity is masculine behaviour that increases suffering in the community or for others, and toxic femininity is the same thing, the use of feminine traits in order to cause or increase suffering within the community or with others?
Yes, I would agree.
So for example, a man using his physical presence to dominate a woman during an argument. Maybe that there was that, I think it was Donald Trump when he was debating Hillary Clinton, and he was stalking her on the stage, like his physical presence. He was using that to try to intimidate her. She actually had to move away from him. That might be an example of that. So it is an actual thing.
Yes. Look, both men and women will have their skills, and just as a woman can use her womanly skills to dominate it, but they'll do it in a more subtle and sometimes a more skilled way than a man. Men are more likely to use physical violence. And when you look at the research on domestic violence, it's about equal. 50% of males and females are responsible for for domestic violence. But of course, man being physically stronger, he causes more injury and more harm. And of course, women end up dying, and we know the statistics on that, one every week. It's absolutely shocking, worse than America, probably the highest in the world in Australia.
I'd like to spend some time on that. Statistics are something that often concern me, the way that statistics are gathered, the way that they're presented. And so we have the statistic of one female partner on average a week being killed in a domestic violence setting by their male partner. That's the statistic we're looking at. That's the event we're looking at. And so my question to you is, if you can, I'd just like to see if you can shed some light on this. Do these deaths occur predominantly in areas with a lower social and economic connection, or areas that are socially and economically depressed, or is it pretty evenly spread across our community? Or have we got I don't like to use the word hotspots.
I think there are hotspots. I think domestic violence occurs across the poor to the rich, to the well-educated, to the non-educated. I think the serious injury and the death is more likely to occur in situations where alcohol and drug are involved and where people are less educated. They don't have the skills to manage conflict, and things get escalated, and they aren't able to de-escalate. And certainly, and certainly in some incidents that the masculinity or the objectification of women that you're talking about, and masculinity of entitlement, she ought to be doing what I want, that issue of control and coerciveness is very powerful. They believe they're entitled to it, to the extent that they may not be intending to kill, but they lose it and they kill, or they feel almost entitled to, or they're even planning to have a murder-suicide, but they can't quite go through with their own suicide. Sometimes we know in the Gold Coast and other areas, sometimes they do, but in a lot of cases, I think it is an intention of suicide. We've all. I mean, I've come across women who have killed their partners, but usually that's in a case of what I call battered wife syndrome. They've experienced domestic violence for so long, they fear he's going to wake up and beat them again, that they drug him or kill him while he's asleep. So you've probably got a defence there, and there's good reason, sort of preemptive action, I guess. But no, yes, the injuries are mostly perpetrated by men. And it is very much connected to hotspots, to alcohol and drugs, and it's interesting when you look at the whole history of alcohol in Australia. Is we were founded on alcohol, the rum industry, going back to that. Our first hospital was built out of the proceeds made out of rum, Sydney Hospital. So our whole history is founded on alcohol in Australia, just very interesting history. And when you look at recent history, you go back to the 60s where women were not allowed in bars. They sat in little lounges. Aboriginals had to go to the back door to get their beer, that discrimination. And of course, women had to cease working right up to 1967 if you're in the public service. But you have seen the increase of feminism in the 70s and 80s, and women striving for that equality with men, saying, we can go out and drink, we can have a good time like men, where really if you go back to the 50s and 60s, it was a man thing. The 5 o'clock swill, the man would knock off work, head to the pub, boozers would close at 6, so they'd drink as much as they could and they'd go home. Of course, you'd have a barney with the wife, which wasn't an uncommon thing in the 50s, 40s, 50s and 60s. But we've seen changes coming about through the feminist movement and the movement for equality, where now girls are saying we want to have more fun. And what we're seeing in drinking trends is interesting. Over the last 5 or 10 years, women, in fact, consuming more alcohol than men. Men's drinking consumption overall, men are still drinking a lot, but overall they're reducing as statistically, where women's are drinking is increasing. And we've also got this issue of preloading, where to save money, because going out drinking is expensive, so they preload or drink before at their girlfriend's place before they go out, and of course they're often intoxicated before they go out, and they're vulnerable even before they go out. And we're seeing women get involved in more physical fights, whereas in their mother's generation you wouldn't have seen that. They might have drunk a wine or two, or they might have kept their drinking or alcohol problems in the home in the 60s and 70s. But certainly from the 80s and 90s, particularly now, we are seeing young women drinking more and young women getting involved in violence more.
Young women are being exposed to. They're being exposed to material that would suggest that it's okay for women to be violent, that previously was not available. And I'm referring directly to, say, the advent of women's boxing, and now the advent of the women MMA mixed martial arts type of fighting, or the UFC type of fighting, which is now a regular. It's a part of the that mixed martial arts scene where it's almost no rules in an octagon until somebody submits or somebody's knocked out. It's very violent. So there seems to be some sort of normalisation of women's violence in more recent years. So it's become part of the landscape, whereas previously it was solely the domain of men.
Yes, I would agree, and I think this movement to equalisation. We can do anything that boys can do. It's almost they're adopting masculine values, sadly. There's nothing wrong with feminist values. I have 3 daughters who are very feminist and very independent and very strong-willed. But I think when they start adopting the bad masculine values of men, which is fighting is okay on a night out. We actually call it drunken deportment theory, and you may have heard of that, where you are almost planning to go out and be bad, but you give yourself an excuse. It's not my fault. I had too much to drink, so therefore I had sex with that woman against their will, or I got drunk and I got into a fight, but it wasn't me, it was the alcohol. It's drunken deportment theory. But really, they were planning to get drunk and so that they could be disinhibited and do the things that they really wanted to do. So we see alcohol being used as an excuse. And we know, of course, in the court system, it might be a mitigation, but it's certainly not
it's not a defence or an excuse.
Not a defence. Because we know the outcome. We know that if we drink too much or we do drugs, things are going to be worse. I think, again, going back to the 60s and 70s, you didn't have ice around and you didn't have the drugs in the clubs around. And we're seeing that added thing in the clubs now, particularly in the Gold Coast and some hotspots in Brisbane. I can tell you where the hotspots are.
Please tell us.
Well, look,
because you have done that research, haven't you?
Yes, I was at as I spent 15 years at QUT, and I'm still associated with Griffith University and other universities in researching with students, and we have looked at women's drinking habits. I also profile crime across various suburbs from Coolangatta, Broadbeach, Nerang, Surfers Paradise, Southport, and looking across some time periods from morning throughout the day and throughout the night, where the different types of crime were happening, and what we found. And what we did find was that we found that break-in enters and stealing occurred mostly on a Tuesday between 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. at Southport.
Wow.
And what we did find that alcohol-related violence and drink driving offences occurred mostly on a Friday, Saturday and early Sunday morning in hotspots like Surfers, Broadbeach and Nerang, where some of your big nightclubs are. And what we did find that evenly across the board every day, there was no specific time for sexual offences. They could occur every day at sort of any time randomly. But with respect to traffic offending, there were 2 periods, that sort of peak hour period around school time, knock off work time, and again late in the evening and early hours of the morning when people were leaving hotels. So that's when your accidents were going to occur. That's when your fights were going to occur. We know extending that further, I had a PhD student who's finished now looking at violence within the Cairns area and the impact of cameras on those areas. We know from that kind of research that 50% of your emergencies in our hospital systems are alcohol and drug related. Take away alcohol and drug problems, we wouldn't have an ambulance ramping system problem.
Yeah, same in my profession. We've had a close look, and a vast majority, I'd say well over 80% of the cases that we conduct have alcohol and or ice as a component of the offence. So if you removed alcohol and methamphetamine, it would be a vastly different landscape. Yeah,
and look, we know that introducing some pre-intervention programs can improve that when we get them early in the hospital system and educate them and identify an alcohol problem and give some education, it can have an effect.
What's your view on the legalisation of drugs?
Of the legal
drugs,
Well, my own view is that if you look into the history of drugs, drugs like heroin were quite legal until the 1950s, and it was a pain relief before we had morphine in World War after World War One. But I think all drugs used appropriately and managed by qualified medical people are useful, including marijuana, including heroin, and including amphetamines. And we're finding that through research, some of it can have benefits in other areas. So I don't discount the value of these drugs, but I do know this, that uncontrolled, they're extremely dangerous. I mean, long-term use of uncontrolled marijuana you'll develop psychosis and paranoia, and withdrawing from it, you'll become abusive to people. There are different grades of marijuana. You can have marijuana with sort of like a level of 3 little at a low level of THC, or you can have it as high as 40, which can just make you paranoia and you can kill people. And ice, people can go psychotic and not know what they're doing and be very dangerous. So look, I think any drug, even if it's a prescribed legal one, if they're not managed, an opioid managed with pain can become quite addictive. You can become therapeutically addicted to a prescribed opiate for back pain or a leg injury or an arm injury. Again, it goes back, this is to the nature of the human being. If you've got a tendency towards addiction, if you haven't, it's not a problem. I mean, I can have a drink or two and it's not a problem, but some people can't. They've just got to keep drinking and drinking. Some people can have a bong or two and it's not an issue, but some people can't. Once they start, they just got to keep doing it and it becomes an addiction. So it's the addiction element of the personality that is the danger, more so than the drug.
Have you ever found any correlation between psychopathy and drug use?
Psychopaths tend to be very they can and do abuse drugs, but a lot of them are more. They're more the leaders in it and the pushers in it. If they haven't got an addictive personality, they will use it to abuse people. That's the kind of link I'd be talking about, rather than causing psychopath. Psychopathic behaviour, I think, goes back to that lack of empathy. It's not related to the use of drugs. I mean, of course, any drugs can aggravate one's sort of tendencies towards being bad, such as a drug comportment theory. But serial pedophiles don't need drugs. They're attracted to children and they lack empathy to children. In fact, they think they're being wonderful to children, and I think they're teaching children.
Thank you very much for listening to another episode of Crime Scene Gold Coast with Guardian Criminal Law. We're enjoying bringing you these podcasts on a weekly basis, and we look forward to bringing you many more. We've got a Patreon page where you can subscribe. That'll assist us in bringing you future episodes, and also any money raised through that goes towards a youth help program that we're running. We look forward to your company for many months to come. Thank you.